making multicellular life in the lab without any intelligence. And we respond to random railings on blogs and in our mailbox. This is one of the most talked about shows on YouTube. This is Genesis Week. And welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy, exclusive right here on YouTube. Every single show has been in the top 10 most talked about videos in science and technology on YouTube. We bring you the information the anti-creationists don't want you to see or hear, and we show the glory of God in creation. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, just punch in Wazooloo.com or GenesisWeek.com and you will find us, or click the ever so convenient subscribe link right there. I'm your host, Ian Juby. Ratcliffe et al., reporting in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, claim to have produced a multi-celled organism from single-celled brewer's yeast. You know, the stuff beer is made of. Well, there's got to be a good science experiment involved then, right? Christy Wilcox of Scientific American wrote about the paper in her Science Sushi blog. It's a big step for evolution, going from a single cell focused solely on its own survival to a multicellular organism where cells coordinate and work together. Creationists often cite this jump as evidence of God's influence because it seems impossible that creatures could make such a brazen leap unaided. But scientists have shown that multicellularity can arise in the lab given strong enough selective pressure. Selective pressure indeed. What did they use for selective pressure? Wait for it. Wilcox explains. Just ask William Ratcliffe and his colleagues at the University of Minnesota. In a PNAS paper published online this week, they show how multicellular yeast can arise in less than 2 months in the lab. To achieve this step, they took brewer's yeast, a common single-celled lab organism, and grew them in a liquid medium. Once a day, they gently spun the yeast in the culture, starting the next batch with whatever cells ended up at the bottom of the tube. Yeah, real gentle-like. If we head on over to the original paper, which is available here, we find that the researchers used good old gravity to turn single-cell critter into a multi-cell critter. Now, as we all know, gravity doesn't do that. So how exactly did they use gravity to accomplish what it normally doesn't do? Well, let's just say they were a little more aggressive in their use of gravity. After the first week, we modified the settling step to be more time efficient by using 100 times G 10-second centrifugations. That's right, 60 times in the centrifuge at 100 Gs! 100 times the force of gravity caused the single cells to cluster together into snowflake-like groups. We verified the selective benefit of the snowflake phenotype, showing that it has a 34% fitness advantage over individual cells under the selection conditions. The selection conditions being G-forces in the centrifuge, by the way. Whereas it appears to suffer a 10% fitness cost in the absence of settling selection. In other words, the yeast clusters that survive the centrifuge don't survive as well in real life, but their characteristics allow them to survive better in a centrifuge. So this evolution of multicelled organisms, if that's what you want to call them, just requires 60 rounds in the centrifuge at 100 Gs. And voila, you have multicellular life. So, which came first, the multicelled organism or the centrifuge? Well, according to the latest scientific research, the centrifuge came first.
1 pound of brewer's yeast, $8. 1 laboratory centrifuge, $2,500. Lab services to spin yeast in the centrifuge at 100 Gs, $200 per hour. Making multicelled life that took no intelligence to make? Priceless. There are some forms of life money can't buy. For everything else, there's MasterCard.
Furthermore, the researchers noted the involvement of cell death with the reproduction of these alleged multicelled organisms. Obviously, this has nothing to do with real-world multicelled organisms, which involve reproduction by giving rise to living cells. But that aside, Even if the researchers had produced a multicelled organism, all they've done is shown that it took intelligence to make it, and the intelligent designers even admitted in the article itself that their multicelled life will not survive as well as the single-celled yeast in the real world. In other words, natural selection will weed out the multicelled organism. This is completely in line with one of the many points I made in my natural selection rant, that single-celled organisms will be favored by natural selection. Therefore, natural selection cannot be the guiding force for evolution because it would weed out multicelled organisms, like us, thus inverting the evolutionary tree of life. In the words of Dr. Duane Gish, it's amazing what an unbeliever must believe to be an unbeliever. Wilcox is quite correct in stating that the creationary thinkers would say that the origins of the first multicelled organism, and the first life, require a creator. This latest research only serves to demonstrate that fact in multiple ways. What do you know? Jesus was right about creation 2,000 years ago. Wonder what else he was right about. Marcelo Gleiser of Dartmouth College wrote an NPR blog entitled "Why Do So Many Have Trouble with Evolution?", in which he asked a series of provocative and frankly leading questions. For example, he said, "The evidence for evolution is overwhelming. It's in the fossil record." Really? And what fossil evidence would that be, pray tell? From the Cambrian right through the Quaternary, we find fossils of organisms that have not changed. The coelacanth first appears in the fossil record, according to your timescale, 407 million years ago, yet it is still around today, unchanged. Same with the Ediacaran fossils of Mistaken Point, Newfoundland. We find fossils of what sure looks like a sea pen, and the fossil trails of sea anemones. How do we know what they are? Because they're still around today. Same thing with Lepistosteus, Arnia, Heliobatus, and Nidea, as well as the palm fronds from the Green River Formation, all around today. Nothing has changed. I could give you probably hundreds of examples like this, but you get the point. What we see in the fossil record is stasis and extinction, neither of which help evolution, but certainly do fit the Genesis account of creation and judgment in a worldwide flood. Gleiser claimed that these fossils are carefully dated using radioactivity. Scientists can get a very accurate measure of the age of a fossil. Hogwash! How many dozens of examples would you like of carefully dated fossils that later on were redated because the careful dating didn't give the age the evolutionary scientists wanted? Skull 1470 was a classic example, using dozens of dating tests confirming one another until the fossil was determined to have been another age based on evolutionary assumptions, at which point a whole pile more careful dating was conducted, thus proving the new date. Radiometric dating doesn't date the fossils, evolutionary assumptions date the fossils. End of discussion. Gleiser went on. But evidence for evolution is also much more palpable. For example, in the risks of overprescribing antibiotics. The more we and farm animals take antibiotics, the higher the chance that a microbe will mutate into one resistant to the drug. Again, apparently Gleiser is unaware of the facts, so allow me to enlighten. Bacterial resistance to antibiotics is a change in the population of the bacteria. The resistant bacteria was already there. There was no evolution. This was demonstrated by the discovery of bodies from the Franklin expedition to the Canadian High Arctic in 1845. After getting stranded in the Arctic, the entire crew died one by one, and some of the bodies were buried on Beechey Island. These bodies were exhumed in the 1980s, and bacteria from the intestines of the bodies were discovered to be resistant to antibiotics. This was some 140 years before antibiotics were even invented. Obviously, the resistant bacteria already existed. Thus, there is no evolution going on here. Antibiotics are simply killing off the bacteria that are susceptible, leaving behind a population of bacteria which are less evolved, because you've now lost some of the variation within that population. You killed them off. Gleiser then levels a criticism against creationary thinkers. Behind this strong resistance to evolution, there is a deep dislike for a scientific misunderstanding of how nature works. Hogwash! Not only has he leveled this criticism against myself, he has also leveled it against the founding fathers of the sciences, who, like myself, considered it God's calling on their lives to search out and understand the created world. You know, people like Newton, Pasteur, Kepler, Boyle, Pascal, Babbage, Joule, Faraday, Maxwell, Sedgwick, Owen, and numerous other fathers of the modern sciences. Then there's the modern scientists like Dr. Raymond Damadian, the inventor of the MRI, Dr. Keith Wanser, professor of physics at Cal State and author of 48 published papers and 7 U.S. patents, or Dr. Jonathan Sanford, co-inventor of the gene gun, or Dr. Robert Herman, retired professor of mathematics at the U.S. Naval Academy, who ranks in the top 2% in the production of peer-reviewed papers, including over a dozen peer-reviewed papers directly related to his general intelligent design model. Obviously, Gleiser's criticism is just plain untrue. This has nothing to do with whether or not I like evolution, Mr. Gleiser. This has everything to do with the truth, to which evolutionary theory seems to have a strange allergy. Woohoo! Mail for me? Once again, Genesis Week was in the top 10 most talked about shows in science and technology on YouTube, thanks to everyone who watched and those who were brave enough to comment. L.A. Wilson kicked things off with more of his delusional rants. Your source for the Nova Scotia claim is Joe Taylor. Ian, are there any standards that you follow? You advance fabricated footprint evidence, and when that is not enough, you appear on a broadcast with someone with a history of advancing fabricated footprints, Carl Baugh, and then you turn to a drunk who does not even hold a degree in paleontology, Joe Taylor. Ian, you are a fake and a fraud, and those who follow you are hypocrites and fools. Now, L.A. Wilson has flown off the handle like this many, many times, embarrassing himself by throwing out a rash of false accusations, and again demonstrating that he didn't even understand what I said. Joe Taylor had nothing to do with the Nova Scotia tracks. I said I did the research. And anybody who knows Joe Taylor knows that he is a highly religious teetotaler in the extreme. So frankly, your slanderous accusations of his being a drunk is utterly ridiculous. I'm trying to be polite here in my wording, which is extremely difficult, because your remarks are so ludicrous. How could you even say this publicly, knowing that people who know Joe Taylor personally are going to read your remarks and point out your foolishness? Oh, you have yet to demonstrate the tracks I have discussed are fabricated, and as for Baugh's fabricated tracks, have you forgotten that those were excavated from underneath 18 inches of solid rock, which was broken up and removed in front of dozens of eyewitnesses? In fact, usually Baugh was just standing there watching and not even being the one digging. Hundreds of eyewitnesses over the years will bear testimony to this, and you have just called all of them frauds and liars as well. Lance, I keep telling you and keep hoping that one day you will learn not to embarrass yourself flying off the handle like this, hurling around such ridiculous, unfounded accusations. So far, it appears you still have not learned your lesson. When will you learn that when you do this, the only one who winds up looking bad is you? There were a number of noteworthy and very interesting comments left on the last program, to which I have nothing to add. I can't help but notice that you have the same problem as I do, continuously win debates, etc., and still be called an unscientific idiot, even when the simple logic is applied to the actual scientific method. Keep going, brother. God bless. Love these vids, Wazooloo. Don't stop doing them. If the Krauss thing is brought up again, you may want to point out that not only does he want to invoke a miracle to kickstart everything, but he's never addressed how he would test for these so-called other universes. I'd love to know he plans to do that, since we've been told for years that science can only test for that which exists in our own universe. This is supposedly why we can't test for God. Seems they have a conundrum. Look at the angry comments below. I guess that's what you should expect from someone who has no argument. One thing leads to arguing with emotion and attacking the person, and that is willful ignorance. Keep the truth coming, Ian. I know lots of physicists, hundreds, and they all tell me, yeah, had to be a creator. The area they don't like is religion, which I tend to agree. A couple of interesting comments were left in discussion by I Love You Viruses and the Science Foundation. Hi Ian, a friendly critique here. It seems that your concepts of stasis and extinction are loaded with evolutionary assumptions. And as you well know, stasis in the fossil record is just the result of interpreting the flooded kinds, aka fossils, as a progression in time. Apart from that, it was all perfect. Thanks for your dedication to the ministry. It saves and will save a lot of souls. God bless you. Thank you, and actually I agree. The problem I run into is, what words should I use? For example, I agree that extinction is an assumption, but the point being that even if the assumption is correct, it still doesn't help evolution. So I play by the evolutionary rules to show that it still doesn't support evolution. And as for the progression of the time allegedly evident in the fossil order, thanks for mentioning this, because nowhere do I mean to imply that there is a fossil order. My own first-hand research all over North America has shown me over and over again there is no fossil order. Which brings us to the Science Foundation's interesting reply to what I Love You Viruses had to say. Except that fossils are not sorted in any way according to their hydrodynamic principles. To say that they were sorted by a flood is to literally say that a flood event laid them down in a way that is in no way indicative of being caused by water. I actually partly agree with the Science Foundation here. The problem is the alleged sorting is non-existent. Yes, there is a partial sorting where typically you find one type of organism with another, but even that tends to be inconsistent, and it's actually inconclusive. For example, coelacanths and whales live together today in the same environment. We also find them both in the fossil record, but to the best of my knowledge, they have never been found together in the fossil record. So the absence or presence of a fossil in a specific layer really has nothing to do with whether or not the organism was there. Now, I could give you literally dozens of examples like this where we know the organism was present, but yet not preserved in the layer. Thus, the alleged fossil sequence is invalidated on this one point alone. I would suggest the evidence for hydrodynamics is in the sedimentology. Funny how ratings have been removed. Typical dishonest Christians. Funny how you didn't address the scientific arguments presented in this video. Typical dishonest evolutionists. Jesus is Lord! In what way, pray tell, is removing ratings dishonest? In fact, throwing around false accusations, like falsely accusing me of being dishonest, is dishonest. I turned off ratings because of anonymous abuse. If people want to abuse me, well, they can leave a comment. None of this cowardly anonymous rating stuff. No. You stick your name on your comment and be accountable for your words and actions. Because I want the whole world to see who the abusers are and just what kind of people they are. Don't be a coward. Vegavis had more to say on the Horton Bluff trackways. As for the Horton trackway, I'm afraid you are the one who is grossly in error. Although I don't fault you, as the article you kindly linked gave incorrect information. I do, however, fault you for relying only on obscure news articles. The crocodile-like creature, Baropesia, is in fact considered to be an amphibian. Although Spencer also stated that the tracks were instead made by a fish, in his actual presentation he linked them back to Baropesia after they found a new specimen. Again, thanks for writing in, but I need to ask a few questions. Found a new specimen of what? More of the fossil footprints? Or Baropesia itself? Where is the fossil foot of Baropesia to compare to the fossil footprints? The footprints of what is claimed to be Baropesia elsewhere do not even vaguely resemble the Horton Bluff tracks. In fact, the original reports specifically mention the absence of claw impressions at the Horton Bluff tracks. As I mentioned, and anyone can go to the trackway and verify for themselves, the tracks were clearly made by a bipedal animal. The tracks perfectly match a known creature, the ostrich. However, that interpretation is rejected in favor of an unknown organism, Baropesia. Lastly, Tube Not Me brought up another interesting example of fossil bird tracks. Here's another case of evidence for birds and rocks too old. June 2002, Nature magazine, bird-like fossil footprints from the late Triassic. These prints were assigned a date of at least 212 million years, some 55 to 60 million years before Archaeopteryx. They're bird-like in all 5 major features of the 7 listed. The other 2, less significant ones, don't indicate they were anything else. In other fields, such contrary data would put a theory in doubt. Thanks for writing in. Well, that's enough for this week. Thanks for making Genesis Week one of the most talked about programs on YouTube. Join me again next Thursday, and please share the show with your friends using the convenient share button down below, easily posting it on TwitFace+. As Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. We'll see you on the flip side.